What's up, nerds? Welcome back to part 2 of how to photograph the northern lights. In part 1, we discussed all of the prediction apps and how to position yourself properly to find the Aurora Borealis in the wild. As you can see, I'm up here in the Arctic. It is rapidly becoming nighttime. We have crystal clear skies and everything looks good. So now we're going to move on and I'm going to talk about how I capture these beautiful lights on my camera. Let's get into it. Now, before we get started, I do want to drop a quick reminder that I teach in-person workshops right here in northern Norway every single February. You can join me and my partner Autumn Schrock in the wild, and we will teach you everything you need to know. We'll help you find the lights and we'll help you photograph them. Click the link in the description below to learn more. First things first, we're going to talk about the equipment needed to capture the northern lights on your camera. Now, it might seem a little bit backwards, but I'm actually not going to start with the camera and the tripod. I'm going to start with your clothing. We are in the Arctic. It is the winter. It is cold. My first time I ever saw the northern lights, it was about 20 below. I was in Fairbanks, Alaska, and I was so excited that I ran outside in my pajamas and my slippers, and I probably kind of risked my health a little bit to take those photos. I do not recommend that, so please, please, please plan for extreme cold weather, hats, fleece, puffy jacket, gloves, warm boots, everything. It might feel like that goes without saying, but I've seen some people come very ill prepared to the Arctic, and I don't want that to be you. Now, moving on to the photography side of equipment, the most important thing to me is a good lens. I always prefer to shoot on prime lenses, and I want it as wide and fast as possible. Right now I have the Sony 14mm f1.8 on my camera. I also use the 20mm f1.8 and the 24mm f1.4. I would say in general, you're going to want to be wider than 24 millimeters and as fast of an aperture as possible. You don't always have to shoot at the maximum aperture. I'll take the f1.4 and I'll stop down to maybe f2 to get it a little bit sharper and have less vignette in the corners. But you want to let in as much light as possible because it's going to be dark out. Remember, this is astrophotography after all. Beyond that, I like to have my lens on a good camera. This is the Sony Alpha 1, but any full frame camera from any manufacturer will do a great job. There are APS-C and Micro Four Thirds cameras out there that will do a good job, but in general, a larger sensor will have a lower sensor noise readout and will produce a cleaner, better image in low light. So if you have the budget for a full frame camera to put that fast prime lens on, you're going to be in a better position. And then of course, what's the point in having this beautiful camera and lens if you don't have a sturdy tripod to put it on? Again, it's the Arctic in the winter, so it's often going to be windy even when you have a crystal clear night. So don't forget a good sturdy tripod to put your camera on. There's a lot of really lightweight travel tripods. I personally don't think this is the instance for that unless you are backpacking through the Arctic. This is the Colorado Tripod Company Centennial with the Aspen ball head. So it's still light enough to fly and hike around a little bit with, but it's still sturdy and it's solid even in inclement weather. And that is the most important thing. One thing I always like to do when I'm out shooting the Aurora is bring some extra batteries. The cold weather will drain your camera a lot faster than you'd think, but don't just keep them in your backpack because your backpack will get cold too. I actually take my batteries and I zip them up inside my coat pocket so that they stay warm with my body heat. So when the one in my camera dies, I have one that's at 100% and it's warm and ready to go. That way I can stay out all night shooting for hours. Now that you have all your equipment picked out, it's time to start changing our camera settings and get ready to photograph the Aurora. Now, this is astrophotography, so the settings are in general going to be very similar to what you're used to from standard Milky Way photography, but there will be some slight differences because the Aurora is significantly brighter than the stars and it also moves much, much faster. So on the lens, I'm going to open my aperture up all the way. This won't be for everybody. Not everyone likes to shoot with an f1.8 lens all the way wide open at f1.8 because you will get some vignetting in the corners. You will get some softness and a little bit of stretching and aberration in the corners. So if you prefer to stop down to f2.8, that's fine. But for me, I kind of like a little bit of vignette in the corners. I think it gives it a fun look. So I shoot wide open. In addition to the wide open aperture, you're going to raise your ISO. For here, standard astrophotography rules apply. ISO 2500 to about 4000 is a great range to be in. The brightness of the Aurora varies a lot, so you're going to have to play with this in the moment and decide if your exposure looks good, but that's a great ballpark to start in. Next is shutter speed, and this is the one that's really, really different compared to Milky Way photography. For the Milky Way, you're going to be doing, 10, 12, 15-second exposures because the stars are pretty dim and they're moving very slow. But the aurora actually moves a lot, and my personal preference is to try and freeze that frame and capture the beautiful textures, because a long exposure, like 15 seconds, ends up just kind of looking like a green blob in the sky. So I will always aim for about a 2.5-second exposure. If the aurora is really dim and moving slow, you can trend as high as about a 6-second exposure, but personally, I wouldn't go any higher than that. Just as an example of what I'm talking about, here's a shot of the aurora shot with a really fast shutter speed. You can see that there are sharp textures in the sky, and it gets this really beautiful jagged look. It really captures the way that the aurora moves like ribbons in the sky. Here's an image shot with a much slower shutter speed, and you can see that you still get a nice green streak in the sky, but it's a little bit more of a blur, a little bit more of just a blob in the sky. Personally, not my preference, and it's not what I aim for. Now, probably one of the most important aspects is your white balance. Cameras will interpret the aurora as kind of a weird, warm yellowish green color, when in reality they're a beautiful deep green, almost bordering on turquoise. So I set my white balance manually all the way down at about 3,500. You can trend as high as around 4,000, but I wouldn't go any higher than that. This is sort of a personal preference, and it really comes down to your own artistic style, but I don't personally like aurora photos with a higher white balance than about 4,000. They start to look kind of a muddy yellowish green, almost brown. I prefer this brilliant deep turquoise, kind of a greenish blue color. That's, to me, much more what they look like in real life. And the last setting to change is to turn on your 2 or 5-second shutter delay timer. If you have a remote trigger for your camera, that's an excellent option as well, but I prefer to try and carry as little equipment as possible and reduce the amount of failure points, just equipment failure possibilities. So I just turn on the 2-second shutter delay and I use that. The reasoning for that is that every time you push the shutter, no matter how sturdy your tripod is, there's an imperceptible shake in your camera just from the action of your hand touching it. Even the most sturdy tripod will move a tiny bit and it will be visible in your photos. It'll kind of come across like softness or a little bit of motion blur. We can ameliorate that by just simply setting a 2-second delay. So when you push your shutter, it waits for 2 seconds and then it takes the image. Gives you enough time for the camera to stop moving after your hand touches it. You're going to come out with crisp images every single time. You're also going to want to go into your menu and make sure that you're shooting raw. Astrophotography is, by its very nature, one of the most difficult settings to capture, so I put mine on fully uncompressed raw. There are compressed, like lossless compressed and lossy compressed options, but I'm going fully uncompressed raw because I want as much data as possible when I start to edit my Aurora photos. If you're shooting both RAW and JPEG, you're going to want to make sure that your camera is set to Adobe RGB instead of sRGB. sRGB is a beautiful color space, and that's what most things on the internet are published in, but it does have a little bit less range than Adobe RGB, specifically in the green channel, which of course is the most important channel when you're photographing the northern lights. Now that all your settings are right, it's time to actually start taking the photos. The last step will be to focus your camera. Of course, your camera is not going to be able to focus in the dark of night on its own with autofocus, so you're going to switch it to manual focus. I pick out a bright star in the sky, and then I turn that focus wheel until the star is as small as possible. On Sony cameras, when you turn that focus wheel, the camera will automatically zoom in on the star. If you press the center of your wheel, it'll zoom in even further, and that gives you an excellent view of what you're looking at in the sky, and you can find that exact focus point. Don't be afraid to go past where it's sharp and back and forth a couple times to make sure that you really find where it's at maximum focus. And also, don't be afraid to pixel peep on an image. Take a sample shot and zoom in afterwards to check your own work. Okay, well, as you can see, it is now officially nighttime and we have gotten lucky. As you can see, the aurora is out. We did all of our homework earlier. We looked at our space weather. We looked at our surface weather. We got ourselves far up into the Arctic. I set all my camera settings from my ISO to my aperture to my shutter speed to my white balance. And here we are outside. It's nighttime. The Aurora Borealis is officially going off behind us, and there's nothing else left to do but to take some photos. Now, there's one more thing I wanted to mention, and that is how to do a Northern Lights time-lapse. If you've watched a couple of my other tutorials on time-lapses, you should be familiar with the general concept. The main thing with the Northern Lights is that you don't want to have your interval too long. They tend to move pretty quick, so a standard astro time-lapse could be anywhere from a 15 to a 30-second interval between photos. The Northern Lights tend to move pretty quick, so as I mentioned before, we're keeping our shutter speed quick, between 2.5 to 4 seconds. Well, same with our interval. I would try to keep my interval around 6 seconds at the longest. I personally don't like Northern Lights time lapses that get really fast and really jittery. I want to see that smooth serpentine motion that they're famous for. I'm running one right here behind me right now. I've got a 6-second interval and a 3-second exposure. This time lapse won't need to run for very long. With only a 6-second interval, 10 or 15 minutes will be plenty to get a beautiful time lapse, but I'm gonna let it run for an hour because the aurora is pretty unpredictable. I want to be able to choose the best parts of it and really focus on when the aurora gets its best. So I'm gonna let that run. I'll play it at the end of this video so you can see how it turned out, but until then, that's all I got for you. Thank you so much for stopping by and watching. Please tell all your friends, hit like and subscribe if you want to see more. And until next time, stay nerdy.